What the European nations have in common, they definitely realize that they are too small to play a role globally on their own. And this applies equally to Germany and Malta, the biggest and the smallest of the EU member states.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. Europe has long been an economic powerhouse but a political lightweight, a union built for peace, not power. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine has forced the European Union to confront something it has never faced: a war on its doorstep. Brussels now talks about weapons, deterrence, and defense cooperation. And with Trump 47's schizophrenic relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Europe faces a defining question: can it stand on its own? Joining me today is Piotr Maciej Kaczyński, lecturer, analyst, and one of Poland's leading experts on EU policy and politics. Together, we'll unpack whether the EU is truly awakening as a geopolitical force, or if it's simply papering over deep divisions. Piotr, welcome to The Focus.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Piotr, is the European Union finally becoming a geopolitical actor or just coordinating national interests under a shared flag?
Well, I would argue that it's not one or the other, that it's always a process of building up a more coordinated approach. What the European nations have in common, they definitely realize that they are too small to play a role globally on their own. And this applies equally to Germany and Malta, the biggest and the smallest of the EU member states. And therefore, this is a tendency that will always push the European nations towards greater togetherness. But at the same time, we live in an era of growing nationalism and nationalists out there, and we see that it's not that easy to converge a nationalistic perspective of various nationalistic forces out there. I mean, we may celebrate elections in Netherlands or elsewhere, but then the same period of time, you will have a nationalist win in Czechia. You will have a number of governments right now that are nationalistic driven. But still, it does not mean that they are not investing into this kind of converging view, because they know that Hungary is small, that even Italy is small, and they are run by one of the most visible nationalistic forces out there to various degrees. I don't want to put nationalistic as purely negative. This is simply a political force that will put nation as the most important element that they will protect, that their job is to promote their nation against everything outside. They will differ, of course, but in principle, to answer your question, the first question is that they know collectively, the leaders of European nations and the heads of the European Union, they collectively know that the way forward is to make sure that this peace in Europe that has been always about maintaining peace between the nations within Europe, that peace needs to be protected against outside threats. And even if for many, many, many years we have had the American umbrella, that we still want to have the American umbrella in Europe, but this umbrella is not as sustainable as it used to be in the past. Hence, we are in the process, as you rightly pointed out, of collectively building a new umbrella that will be our umbrella protecting us against the world. And it's really interesting because the Chinese have a very similar perspective. The Chinese seem to be thinking about the world in the geopolitical terms, that there will be three major blocks in the world: the Chinese bloc, dominant according to the Chinese, the American world, the world of the seas with the American allies around the world, with Japan, Australia, and then the European bloc, where the Chinese see Europe as this emerging power which is independent from United States, but it's still lacking identity. So that is really interesting perspective from the Chinese angle. But it's also showing where we are in Europe. In Europe, we are struggling to stay united, and then collectively, how do we define our borders vis-a-vis US a little bit? We are like a teenage kid who needs to identify themselves from the parent, but this time we are the kid and US is the parent, and move forward in the world.
Piotr, this is a very old European story. I mean, prior to us hitting the record button, we were talking about the debates 100 years ago, with regard to countries like Poland and how it formed out of the ashes of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was the old Soviet Union, there was the old Yugoslavia. All of them were multi-ethnic constructs, if you will, and none of them really survived. I mean, they went on for a long time, but then, how do you stretch a long time out? I mean, arguably the Austrians had the longest time, going back centuries. The Soviets, not so much, about 70 odd years. The Yugoslavs, again, about what was that, about 50 odd years since the end of World War II. Then, when Tito died, that was the end of everything. So it shows that there is something about European divisions that require a strong center. But once that strong center is gone, the thing that holds the political structure together disappears, and people revert back to their local, cultural, autonomous groupings. Is this a real danger for the European Union as it starts trying to find its feet as a geopolitical power, that it will break apart before it becomes a truly strong entity?
It's a very good illustration into the pan-European struggle over the last 40 years or so. That how much united should we be vis-a-vis how should we celebrate our differences? United in diversity is the European motto at the end of the day. So we are celebrating diversity, but at the same time, we are putting a lot of harmonized rules out there to make sure that we live by the same standards or by the same rules. And that is exactly creating the tension that you just described. How much is too much? We have had Brexit, and that is really illustrative
Right.
for showing that for the British public at the time, that was the year 2016, it was a slim majority, but majority nevertheless, of people who believed that it went too far. And Britain was the least integrated nation of the EU at the time because they've had their opt-out from Schengen, they've had their opt-out from the euro, the common currency. They've had multiple other opt-outs as well, and still they believed that they were ruled by Brussels. And that's a very relevant point because the perception by an average 450 million European that if they are ruled by Brussels, this is when the problems will begin. And that's exactly the problem of the Soviets, of the Yugoslavs, Austro-Hungarians. None of those
Yeah.
systems was democratic. And
Mhm.
if the power is bottom up, and if we follow in Europe what the Europeans collectively want, every European citizen has a European passport and a national passport. European elections and national elections. And the Europeans collectively know that those European elections do matter more and more. Every 5 years, there is three terms right now. There was a growing participation. There is a growing awareness that Europe is responsible for some of those rules. And then it is Europeans who see that our little Polish or our little Italian army is not going to defend us against the Russians. Of course, it doesn't mean that we will immediately create a European army. No, because that's exactly where you will have your nationalistic or national perspective that you don't want to give up on your national army. I mean, we can go back in history to 1950s when the French rejected the idea of a European army, which would mean to give up the French army.
Yep.
This is not happening. But what is happening is a more finesse to this project. You keep your national armies, but they have to be integrated with each other. So they have to be able to work together. They have to be able to procure machines and guns and ammunition together. That we need to coordinate between member states the production of those elements, and especially ammunition right now. We are going to have the kind of common procurement like we saw with the vaccines. Now we are going in during COVID. Now we may be seeing a joint procurement for some elements which all member states are lacking, and we may be collectively in need of that. For example, anti-drone wall on the eastern flank, which would be built independently by the countries which are on the eastern flank. Poland just announced that it's going solo on this matter because Poland's afraid that the European may be late. And there is an issue of timing as well, that if you do things nationally, it may be faster. But it never stopped anyone in Europe ever. If you do something first, then the Europe will follow, so to speak, along the lines of the country or countries that went first. And that's exactly how Europe moves forward. It wins between the ideas, initiatives that are developed locally, and then taking the best examples and promoting those best examples among 27. And of course, there's an issue because, for example, if you followed the last meeting of NATO leaders and the problem with the Spanish Prime Minister who said, "But I'm not gonna spend 5%
Right.
on defense," right?
Right. Right.
Because
Yeah.
he's a Spanish leader. He doesn't have an eastern border. He doesn't see those problems as closely as others. It's easier for the Portuguese because there's a Portuguese president of the European Council these days. So he's responsible for the entire union, and therefore this Portuguese link is better. But the Spaniards are a bit more on the back seat on those topics. But believe me, this issue is not one or the other. It's always a process of deliberation and getting those partners on board with everybody else. Even the one that is hated in the media, the Hungarian leader Viktor Orban of from Budapest, Hungary, he is agreeing. I mean, if we are seeing the European Council conclusions on defense matter, Hungary is on board. Even we had 19 package of sanctions against Russia. Hungary and Slovakia signed up to the package of sanctions against Russia. So it's not that those countries that are bombarded in the European media that they are, I don't know, chauvinistic, pro-Russian, Putin camp. Not exactly. They have their own way of doing business, and talking with each other is the European way. The problem with talking, it takes too much time often,
Yep.
and we see that when it comes to military, when it comes to taking action, especially defensive action, you have to have the chain of command, and that's where we enter into this realistic world where you need to establish this chain of command. And right now we have NATO. So NATO is there. It's the same European countries. Every now and then you'll have a text that, oh, will EU double what NATO does? EU will never double what NATO does because EU and NATO are the same countries, except with a few exceptions, because there's United States in NATO, of course, United Kingdom, Canada, Turkey. The biggest, the difference is Norway as well, but also a few Balkan countries, for example. So the NATO is not going to be threatened by the EU. EU is simply another club of the same member states on the European continent that need to take precaution in case. There is a president of the United States that one day will just pull off that umbrella that I was talking about. If there is no American umbrella, then we will have a big problem in Europe. And in case that happens, we need to be ready. Because when there was a wave of Russian drones or coming to Poland, it was Italian, it was Dutch, it was Polish military that together shot them down. So that is not a problem, but coordination was within military, within NATO. So there are protocols in NATO that allow for that defense to take shape. Now, we collectively Europeans are playing right now in 2025, end of 2025, to maintain NATO, North Atlantic alliance with the United States. How long will it hold? We just don't know because we are all prone to elections and other processes bottom up. The same processes that are bottom up challenging European unity are challenging American democracy, and not only American democracy. There's a lot of processes in our democratic societies that are new, and we do not know what the future will hold. How strong and how radical will the nationalist forces be in the future?
Piotr, you raised a lot in that segment, and I just want to unpick some of it. I mean, from an Australian perspective and of European origin, I can honestly say, hand on heart, what you've said to me sounds extremely reasonable, and I think that most of our audience would say the same thing. But the caveats really come down to the notion of culture, and I'm not just talking about culture in terms of the Germanic speaking peoples, the Italic speaking peoples, and so on and so forth. I'm talking about organizational culture, because I'm associated with a number of relatively senior ex-NATO people, and we often get around the table and virtually at least and have a chat about European defense. And there is a real fear among the military old salts, just formerly recently retired from NATO, that Europe isn't moving fast enough, that there is not much of a connection between NATO and the EU, not in the way that they want to see it. Because, of course, people in the military are then responsible for the defense of the European space. But if they keep on getting hampered by European politics on the ground, because again, as you unpacked it, it seems very much like the EU is an organic institution. You say ground up, and that's fine. That's fine for politics. It's not necessarily fine for hierarchical structures that all national militaries happen to be, so that they will respond to a central command from a headquarters. But when Europe is not that central command, when there is no European military policy, when there's no European foreign policy where Europe speaks with one voice, people tend to get a bit, angry, confused, frustrated, not knowing what they're meant to be doing because they seem that the political leadership always sits on top like a great weight on their shoulders. So they're a problem, not a solution to a problem. How would you answer that?
I love those kinds of fears because those fears are real. You see,
Yeah.
that they come from people who are witnessing challenges day by day, and they are seeing the weaker elements of the system, how slow the EU machinery is, the consensus-driven machinery is, how we need a chain of command that will take effective action. But there is always a way to test. When I mentioned to you the drone threat in
Mm.
September that came from Russia, 19 between 19 and 30, by now we know that it's about 19 to 30 drones, crossed the NATO eastern flank, flew over Belarus or Ukraine into the territory of NATO, and was a coordinated activity of multiple European armies to shoot them down. Then it tells you there is a third element here. It's not only EU and NATO. There is a European NATO,
Mhm.
the European nations in NATO. And the European nations in NATO stepped in. They used force. I can give you another example. There is a case that a lot of European military do not remember anymore. Over 10 years ago, when European military shot guns against Somali pirates in Somalia on land. So not against ships that were attacking, but on land. And that was the first time that European, and it was a European military initiative, used military tools to fight a adversary somewhere else, and that effectively killed the piracy on the ground in that place for a number of years at the time. That's early 2010s. So Europeans are capable. The problem is, of course, about where is the switch. And we are not going to see that switch. Why? Because doing the switch, having a European headquarters, military headquarters, for example, would be viewed politically as an anti-American step. And we do not want for that to happen. We need to be ready to step in with a decision like this the moment Americans step down or step outside, so to speak. Americans did step out in eastern Poland when this situation happened with the Russian drones. It was a German newspaper that revealed that one of the drones or multiple of the drones were targeting a airport in Rzeszów, which is southeast of Poland, which has been used since 2022 by Americans and everybody else in NATO as a main hub for flying in military equipment that is then put on rails and sent to Ukraine. It's a hub. It's a major hub. And until early 2025, there were American military protecting that airport. They were stationed there. Comes Donald Trump, removes the American soldier from that airport. They are replaced by other NATO military, but not American. Now, enter politics and high politics, global politics. If you see Vladimir Putin talking to Donald Trump in Alaska or elsewhere, what are the chances for a Russian drone to attack an American soldier or vice versa? American soldier attacking a Russian soldier? Almost zero. But if it's not an American, if it's another NATO, then it's the probability goes up. So there is this moving target, America. Where is United States in this equation? So I know that the military people like clear chains of commands. Of course they do. But politically, it's not probable. If you ask me today, are Europeans going to have military headquarters without United States tomorrow? I would say no, because they are fighting for America to stay in. But should America decide to go out, EU will take it slowly, but there will be this European NATO thing, which means effectively there are protocols within NATO to engage in specific situation on a specific front, and it's done within NATO between military. And then for that to be transferred, is it NATO? Is it EU? It's secondary. For the citizen, it's important to know that the border is secure. And we saw in September who secured that border. It was a European members of NATO.
Yes, I fully agree and concur with what you say. But to be fair, that was a limited action. And yes, the forward deployed forces, the European forward deployed forces, did do their job and did it very professionally. But when we're looking at the European space today, and we're already starting to see glimmers of it, okay, you can say that perhaps the Russian drone overflight over Poland was part of it. The MiG-31s flying over Estonia, the Russian MiG-31s, was another part of it. But we're also starting to see some sort of organized campaign against Europeans at the political level, where it hurts, where it becomes very difficult to determine, is this a threat to any nation state? Is this a threat to Europe? We're living in a world of hybridized, or as I like to call, asymmetric war. Now, these wars are political wars. These are not easy to determine wars. You usually only get the evidence of someone doing something terrible after the event. So there's very little forward momentum to get advanced warning of an attack by some paid off local criminal group in the pay of, one of Putin's thugs, for instance. So again, there is a case to be made that perhaps the Europeans need to have that center for them to be on top of these ever changing hybrid asymmetric attacks, some which won't be very obvious at all until they happen. And, if the attack happens to be big enough, it's going to devastate the local area that's been targeted. So, again, putting my military hat on, I'm saying to myself, well, where will Europe be under those circumstances?
Yep. Look, I'm not saying no to this. What I'm saying is going to take longer, and in the meantime, the Europeans are developing a lot of basic capabilities. Let me just quote to you one of the latest council figures, and I'm reading from their communiqué de presse. In 2024, defense expenditure rose to 1.9% of EU member states' GDP, up
Mm.
from 1.6 in 2023, so 0.3%. It is expected to reach estimated 2.1% in 2025. That means that the budget spent by member states on defense in 2024 was 343 billion euros. And that is a much, much higher number than if you compare it to early 2000s. So within 20 years, we are spending a lot on the defense. Now, this is the reality that the curve goes up. The question is it high enough? Is it fast enough? Is it climbing up enough? Because, for example, when previous German chancellor tried to speed up the transformation of the German aircraft, he was told in late 2010s that or early 2020s that he will have to wait 10 years before the first aircraft arrives. So from the order before they are actually delivered. So
Yeah.
that's a little problem. You have this experience of what was a Danish procurement of some American Patriots, I think it was, and
Mm.
the producer of Patriots said, sorry, we have limitations on the speed of production of those goods. So there are questions of how fast, but that's only one question, and a lot of people are interested in this. There's another question, of course, how do you coordinating spending that money? And that's exactly where the EU is already on it. That the member states are not duplicating their spendings, that they coordinate their spendings. This is the most important element right now, to spend that money effectively. So they talk, and they have to talk because they have to be transparent internally. If you talk about defense issues, those are one of the most secured, security-driven elements in discussion. And we have our military dialogue. We have our military structures within the EU where the military people from armies talk to one another. There is a permanent military ambassador to the EU, not only to NATO, but to the EU from each of member states. And they do engage with their partners to make sure that it's coordinated activity. And then EU also spends more money. For many years, one of the predicament of the European taxation or budget has been if you don't spend the EU money on agriculture, on regional policy, which is aid to our regions, on anything, that the money returns to member states that paid in. in proportion, right? So you have extra spending. For the last 5 years, it's no longer the case. The money that is not spent on agriculture, that is not spent on anything else, regional policy, is staying in the EU budget and is transferred to defense, primarily Ukraine. I mean, this has to be
Yeah.
said out loud that
Mm.
Ukraine and this a lot of our defense budget is actually linked with the situation in Ukraine, with the war that Russia is leading in Ukraine. With Donald Trump, the pressure is even greater on
Yeah.
Europeans to supply Ukrainians. So Europeans are in their planning taking responsibility for the union of 27 member states and Ukraine at the same time. It requires so much coordination because you with Ukraine you have to coordinate what Ukraine needs, who can supply it, who will pay for it, when it will happen, and it works. We cannot say it doesn't work. Of course, we would love for Ukraine to win this war tomorrow, recover all its territory, and have Russia surrendered to Ukraine, and we'll have a peace plan. But for the moment, we are doing utmost we can to support Ukraine to sustain itself and fight the enemy with limited resources because Americans have switched from supplying Ukraine to selling to Ukraine, but who's paying for it? Europeans are supposed to pay for it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, more pressure on Europeans from our partner slash ally, United States. Not an easy situation, and pressures there, internal and external and financial, and it's still not cracking. So the very fact that it's not cracking has to be viewed positively. Not, of course, to say, ah, it's not cracking, it's great, let's do nothing. No, but they are engaged within what's possible. And that is, if you like, maximizing of your possibilities today of what you have within the reality out there. It's not the perfect situation. It's not a perfect scenario, but within what's possible, a lot is being done, and I'm going to praise them for it. As a person sitting outside of that structure, I'm not employed by the EU. I'm not their spokesperson. Should they do more? Of course, they should do more. Examples of nationalism in play? Of course, there's plenty. Just look at Belgium and their prime minister, who is saying, "Oh, I cannot agree to this plan of using Russian frozen assets because I'm threatened that in the future Russia may sue Belgium for that money and win in arbitrage."
Mm.
That's a very weak political argument that you can easily go around and solve this and address this issue between lawyers of Belgian from Belgian government, commission government, sorry, from commission lawyers, and sit together and solve this issue. But the nationalistic prime minister there is in Belgium is saying, I'm not going to play. I'm too threatened. My country is threatened. So my country's priorities are come first before Ukraine or larger Europe. So you have examples of both.
Yeah.
But does it mean that we are not going to address this issue or keep on trying to address this issue? Of course, we are going to try to address this issue. And this is why the frustration comes in that it's delayed, because it's always delayed. But the same with the Americans, and they have a chain of command which is great, right? If Biden gave tomahawks to Ukraine in 2023 or 2022, it would be so much different. And
Mm.
only now Americans are gradually sending or selling better tools to Ukrainians, but also Ukrainians are better trained and better able to use some of those um, army elements,
And
weapons.
obviously the Ukrainians are doing so much of the heavy lifting themselves. I mean, when they were part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was a chief engine driver of creating and sustaining the Soviet military. So they have that ability to take what we give them, what we in the West are giving them, and repurpose everything for the Ukrainian war effort, which has to be mentioned as well. It's not just about the outsiders supporting Ukraine, it's what Ukraine is doing for itself, which hopefully in time when the war is over will then be able to, or the Europeans will be able to exploit their relationship with Ukraine to help in the development of their own military capabilities. But speaking of this, something did come up, Piotr, and that is you talk about budgets and they are important. But that's not the thing that gets people motivated to fight and defend European
course,
space wherever it's attacked.
of course.
So, and again, the politics of Europe is very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not divided like in the United States. It's fractionated in a peculiar way, ethnically, sectarian, in all manner of different ways and means. So, what is Europe? And
Mhm,
do Europeans want to defend Europe? Because if we talk about
mhm,
Europe having a defense base, but that defense
mhm.
base is all located in nation states where people have their primary loyal to Italy or Poland or Germany. Okay, they can all go rally around the flag, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to pick up a pitchfork for the EU because the blue flag means different things to different people. And there is hostility among the populists, the right wing, against Brussels and against what they perceive as a repressive instrument that is trying to destroy national culture, national identity, language, all of this kind of thing. It's not necessarily true, but there is that reality that they're dealing with because they can't quite understand what all of this bureaucracy is. If we take an example, for instance, the founding fathers in the United States created their constitution. It was, by all accounts, a rather simple document when weighted against the European Constitution, which I'm pretty sure very few people outside of Brussels have even read the first couple of pages because it is about yay thick. And it's written in technocratic language that most people don't understand. So again, I mean, yes, when we're talking about European defense, budgets are important, technology is important, but the European citizenry is important. Where do you think they stand?
Mhm. It's a beautiful question, and you are so right. I mean, there is no one answer to this question. Of course, academics are calling it multi-level governance.
Yeah.
That the rules are made at different levels, and in a kind of confederal model. So people
Yes.
who live in federal systems will understand it a little bit better.
Mm.
It took Switzerland, which is another confederacy, it took Switzerland so long time before Switzerland could give voting rights to women. It was the last Western country to do so in the 70s when the
Mm.
Swiss decided that because it's a confederacy. So all the men in majority of
Cantons.
the cantons had
Mm.
to be in favor on top of
Yep.
majority of the population,
Yep.
which was not easy. It
Mm.
took Switzerland up to 2000s to join UN
Mm.
for the same reason. Some
Mm.
things are extremely long and delayed. Look, it's a pros and cons. I mean, you keep on underlining the forces that go bottom up against the center. Those powers, those forces are very strong in Europe. They've always been very strong in Europe from the 50s. So
Mm.
this is good because it gives the sense of reality check and reality control vis-a-vis what the top-down approach does. The latest example of this confrontation, top-down and bottom-up, is in climate policy, and it's in transition.
Right.
I'm not going away from defense because the two are very
Mm.
closely linked, but
Mm-hmm.
Europe took the initiative to be the leader in that process. I mean, only today when we are recording, there is this UN process in Belém in Brazil begin, and the day before, European member states decided that they agreed to the idea that there should be decarbonization of 90% of European economy by 2040, which is a very, very ambitious level. And of course, there will be a lot of forces criticizing this and going against this. But 90%. That is Hungary and Italy on board with that, and Slovakia and Poland and everybody else. So it's not easy to say that there is a certain process against, because there's a even greater process to get together. Why the member states right now agreed to 90% is because we probably have crossed a certain threshold when it comes to climate, that right now with our super expensive energy prices, it turns out that it's a massive, massive recognition that green is cheap. And investing into sustainable is investing into cheaper economy resources. So that is a transition that even nationalist forces embrace. Our kind of defenders of the old regime, coal miners, they are in minority. Even among the nationalists. So we are crossing the Rubicon here when it comes to climate. And that is possible thanks to the leadership. There were plenty of mistakes, and we have the regulation processes to correct some of the mistakes made over the last 6, 7 years. But what I'm indicating is that Europe still moves forward. Europe is not paralyzed, despite the forces that are bottom up challenging Europe. A lot of those nationalists out there are socialized. I mean, the very easy process, easy, not easy, it's never easy, but the process of socialization is taking place. You have Jacques Chirac, I mean, long forgotten French president, who is remembered for being pro-European. He started as an anti-European. He campaigned in 1990 against the Treaty of Maastricht. Uh, to be on the other side, I can give you an example of Margaret Thatcher, who campaigned pro EU or whatever it was in the 70s in a referendum, and then of course give me my money back, and launched the Brexit campaign effectively that ended in 2016. So there are two sides to every coin, but if you take one of the most visible nationalist leader out there these days is the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, and she is contributing. She is engaged. She is not leaving the room like de Gaulle did in the 60s. She wants to be part of it. This is fantastic because when you go to Italy and Germany, those are two countries where, because you asked about the culture, and I think culture is crucial to understand. Because before I go to Italy and Germany, let me just explain one thing. You will have majority of nations in the EU that are very proud of themselves.
Yep.
Think about the French, think about the Spanish, think about the Polish, Swedish, Finnish, Greek. There's a bunch of them that are very proud nationals of their nations, and then Europe comes secondary. And here comes definitely Italy, and in second place, Germany. Those nations have very little pride in their own history. There's very little to be proud of. Are you going to be proud of Mussolini? Are you going to be proud of Hitler? No, they have a very strong sentiment linked to it's kind of part of their culture now that both Italy and Germany are identifying their nationality within Europe. So even the most nationalistic politician in Italy is going to be a European politician. So even Salvini is going to be pro-European. Salvini doesn't want to leave the Eurozone. He doesn't want to leave the Union. If you talk the Germans, AfD is very far right. They may be critical on the migration policy, which is very radical in Germany, and is a big debate on this. But then both CDU, which is a massive party, identity of CDU is linked directly to identity of European integration. There is no going away from it, and nobody's going to challenge that. Nobody's challenging that within the largest German party, the Konrad Adenauer party, that is nothing linked to the old German history, be it Hitler, be it Bismarck before. So this is a new West German identity. Of course, there's the legacy of Prussia. This is where the Germans
Yeah.
are struggling with, and this is untold story because denazification never happened in East Germany, and they never took it up after 1990 reunification. They should have. We should have done it in Eastern Europe too, because we see that those debates that Western Europeans had in the 60s, in the 70s, we have never had. And those issues are coming up now between liberalism moving forward. What is the role of my 10 million people state in the world? We mean nothing, we can do nothing. So what can we do, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of nations have that kind of identity challenges. But then come post-Soviet and post Yugoslav nations whose identities are yet different because they don't have a problem to identify themselves in a larger family of nations that is democratic. The problem of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and the Slovenes, Croatians has always been that their previous pan-nation states were not democratic. Their voices were not heard. And now they are being heard. Now they are being taken serious. They are being defended. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they don't have their aircrafts. It is always the aircrafts of NATO countries patrolling their airspace. The Slovenes, the Croatians, they have a lot of animosities between them, but they do sit together and they don't have problems addressing the issues at the larger European level. Even the nationalist forces in those countries, because the issue, and it's really funny, the issue of nation state goes down to Westphalian belief, and this is kind of coming out. I just read this morning something somebody wrote on China that the world today is much more Westphalian in the meaning that sovereign states are able to defend the way they are and their leaders the way they are vis-a-vis the outside world better. That the human rights, democracy, all that is relegated, not as important. That's a kind of Chinese perspective on things. And in Europe, it doesn't really happen as much. We have our countries and our cultures and our histories are telling us that our powers are not pure Westphalian. Why? Because over half of Europeans are coming of a Catholic background, and Catholic background is telling you that you have two centers of powers always. One is the
Mhm.
national one, and the
Yeah.
second is the church, which
Sure.
escapes the borders, and that's relevant. That's not irrelevant. So I would have more problems with the Protestant countries that are more tend to be kind of holistically closed, but those that have a strong Catholic heritage will have this element within their conservative, within their nationalistic forces of actually engaging with fellow Europeans. There's bigger criticism of the left from the perspective of nationalists in Europe today than of each other. Let me put it this way. So you have a transnational dialogue between Meloni people and the Polish nationalists, and you will have very little racism against each other. There is still with the Romanians. So Romanians and Italians, they are at odds because there is a racism within the nationalist forces of two countries. But apart from that particular case, the rest is not viewing itself that badly anymore.
Piotr, you raised again a number of points in this, and I want to reflect on one of them. You were talking about European parliamentarians and the centrality of nationalists being able to talk civilly to various other people across cultural and linguistic barriers. And look, the European Parliament serves a purpose, I suppose, and I'm only speaking from an Australian perspective, so please forgive me. But the one thing that I can also counter that with is that, yes, but you had Nigel Farage as a member of the European Parliament,
Yeah.
who was white-handing Britain's position so badly that it also accelerated the very anti-Europeanism that you found in London. And now we have Brexit. So
Right.
there is that sort of countervailing aspect. But I do
Yep.
take your point, and I think it's a very important point. And my friends and I often reflect on this because we're all quite astounded by Georgia Meloni. I mean, she is from the right, and she's the most pragmatic person from that part. Now, can you say, hand on heart, if the AfD were to take over in Germany, that its leadership would adopt a pragmatic response like Georgia Maloney, or is Maloney something different? Is she reflective of a peculiar modern Italian culture where she understands power in a more sophisticated way than, say, for instance, a Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or a Nigel Farage in the UK or the AfD in Germany? I mean, where does all this lie and how can we connect the dots here?
That's a very good point as well. I think this plays exactly to my argument that Italians are different because their political identity, their national identity is so much weaker.
Yeah.
There is this notion in Italy that we created Italy, let's create Italians
Mm,
from 19th century. So there is a tendency in Italy to believe that Italians is a concept, a future, a you need to engage to have that because truly you have the northern Italians, you have the southern Italians, you have the Sardinians,
yep.
Sicilians, etc.,
Yeah.
etc., etc.
Yeah.
So Italy is a bit special. The problem with AfD I have is that they are very Prussian in their approach. So they are not exactly reformed. They are not Adenauer people. They are not
Mm,
Catholic people. They are coming from this Prussian angle of Germany. And
mm,
then it comes down to leaders. I mean, individual leaders. You mentioned Farage, you mentioned Meloni, how different they go and they come from the same kind of wall, if you like.
yeah.
Wilders, really interesting because
Hmm.
Geert Wilders is kind of between the two, that he is as radical as Farage, maybe even more radical when it comes to racism, when it comes to anti-Islam, but he is as pragmatic turns out. As Meloni, he had a government for 2 years. He never
Mm,
entered the government, but he was backing the government for 2 years. In recent elections, he was punished by voters in for it. Um, but the real test will be, of course, France.
mm,
What Because AfD coming to power. Look, my bet would be that they will be, if they don't reform internally, that there is a real life threat for them to be considered illegal in Germany. Germany has a radical policy to fight post-fascism within their constitution. They have instruments, they have institutions to fight it. So if there was a threat coming from AfD to challenge the German domestic system, then the Germans still have that trigger to defend themselves, and we are not getting there. There is the German politics is, let's put it on the side, but the French politics is much more closer to be the test of that system. How pragmatic would France be should there be a nationalistic
Yeah.
president in France, or even prime minister for that matter, because that could happen as early as 2026, president 2027. So that is a big question. I cannot give you the answer because, as we see with Meloni, there were so many threats with Meloni. There was this when Meloni was elected. Then von der Leyen was in the U.S. and she had a very radical message to the new Italian leadership, saying that you cannot break rule of law.
Yeah.
If you break rule of law, there will be consequences. And I think Meloni recognized that there's lots of links between Meloni and the German Christian Democrats, not necessarily the Italian, but the German Christian Democrats. So there is a way of having conversations, but it shows you, and I think this is a very important point that maybe escapes a lot of people, is that Meloni recognizes power because power recognizes power. Brussels is power. We may be critical of it, the nationalists may be challenging it, but it is the center of power. And the change from the founding fathers of Europe are that they built that power. So that there was no power in the 50s when Monet created the high authority, when Schuman had his declaration, and Walter Heustein led the first European Commission. That power came to existence in the 50s and 60s and onwards with Delors in the 80s and 90s. And today we are where we are. Meloni simply recognizes that power, that in order to reform Italy, you need to have assistance from Brussels. Thatcher was engaged with Delors to reform UK. And that went well for Thatcher. And then they engaged to reform the rest of Europe. That was the big political plan from Thatcher perspective. But there were other elements that came in the 80s, and she was not so keen on anymore. When Meloni comes in, she sees this big power, Brussels. It's not a threat to the Italian identity. It can be helpful to reform Italy the way she wants it. So she engages. And the same way, Mateusz Morawiecki, who was a Polish nationalist prime minister for many years, also engaged with Brussels. Right now, he's a president of ECR post Meloni, and he's having his visions laid out in his speeches in Heidelberg, not only in Poland, but also in other places. So there is a certain nationalist light perspective of where to take the EU, not necessarily forward. They don't necessarily would like to have this European military headquarters. They don't like to consider divorcing United States. They want to keep things as they know, which is the things as they are today under current treaties. There are some people who want to change the treaties and take them down. Viktor Orban, for example, he doesn't like European Parliament for a
Yeah.
change, but there are this. And maybe we should give names for that. Meloni and Morawiecki, the Polish former prime minister, this is party called European Conservatives and Reformists, ECR. And they are the closest to the mainstream, if not the mainstream today. And then you have more radical conservatives slash nationalists, and this is called right now Patriots for Europe. And this is Viktor Orban, this is Andrzej Babiš, the incoming Czech prime minister. This is Gerd Wilders' party. And then you have the third, which is called Europe of Sovereign Nations, and this is where AfD is. And AfD, from all of them, is considered the most radical, the most extreme, potentially the most threatful. Incidentally, the Le Pen party, the French Le Pen party, is in Patriots for Europe, so she's right to Meloni. But at the same time, there seems to be this year, 2025, a much greater sense of trying to engage the patriots, especially from the EPP perspective. European People's Party, the Adenauer in history, today a dominant political force in Europe, and they do deals with the patriots more and more. So it may have a peculiar effect because it may well happen in 2027 when there's French presidential elections, and if the candidate of the far right is not Le Pen, because most likely she will not be able to run. So somebody else is supposed to run. So maybe it is Mr. Bardella, who's the leader of that party in the European Parliament. And he, by being engaged in the European Parliament by the EPP, once and if he's the president, it's not as dramatic as we may think. I'm not saying it's not dramatic. It will be dramatic in its own way, but maybe there will be a settlement of some sort, allowing for that bicycle to move forward.
Okay, Piotr, I need to rein us back to where we started off, and we were looking at the military equation. From a military perspective, and I know that many of my colleagues in Europe also feel concerned by this, how different threat perceptions between Eastern and Northern Europe on the one side sit against those of Western Europe on the other side. How does this play into this whole notion of EU unity,
Yeah.
or does it simply undermine it?
That's a very good one as well. Look, the perception of threat is maybe not radical because the majority of Europeans, including the Spaniards, will perceive that Russia is the biggest threat out there. Uh, it's a pan-European sentiment that will be higher in the east, the closer you are to the eastern border and in the Baltic area. So the Swedish, the Danish are there. The Danish, incidentally, will have a little Greenlanders perspective, so their threat is United States as well. But you cannot perceive United States as a threat number one. It's more linked to Donald Trump in predictability rather than anything else. Another threat that for some people is very, very relevant is migration. And this is migration threats, integration of migrants who have arrived, what would happen next. 2026, we'll see that our migration pact, agreed a couple of years ago, will enter into force. What was it? Belgium and Netherlands are calling for other countries to fully implement it. Some countries are not going to implement it. Poland got a leeway from the Commission that doesn't have to implement it fully because it hosts a lot of migrants. Maybe some other countries will follow. I know I've checked for countries like Sweden or Romania that are different, and they both are implementing the migration pact. So it looks rather positive. But the threat of migrants is not as big in Romania. Very few migrants migrating to Romania, but it is among the people who see that as a threat, especially those voting far right, and that is across. It will not be in one country or other more than others. That stretches from Poland down to Italy and Spain. But then you will have a growing challenge, which is actually worldwide challenge, which is demographics. I mean, this is something that we do not talk enough, but for a lot of people out there, this becomes an issue. A couple years ago, I went down to Italy and Malta, and Greece, but particularly in Italy, we were talking about with researchers on agriculture and migration and agriculture, and the researchers, I remember that very well, tell me that back in 2020 when we did this project, that the Italian agriculture is not sustainable without migrant workers, that you need those workers to come and do the fields to collect whatever is growing on them, and that is really telling a story not only about migration, but not only from the perspective of integration, but also from the economy. But also, and that's a crucial one, on the landscape of who is populating our rural areas in Europe. Because if we need those migrants and they will come here and they will live in our villages, that will create such a challenge when it comes to integration, that might create extra problems, and challenges for the future. All I want to say is that Europe is full of problems, but still it goes forward.
Okay, well, yes, yes, it does. Um, we talked about Trump, but not probably enough. There are many people that I know of who consider the Trump administration an American aberration,
Mhm.
and that once he's gone, that'll be it. America will go back to normal and everything will be fine. But I tend to think that perhaps it's not going to work out as easily as this. We do have another guy that's waiting in the wings at this point in time, a man by the name of JD Vance, who doesn't get enough airtime, and I think strategically so. But his views on Europe and the transatlantic alliance are even worse than Donald Trump. So,
Also,
while the EU may not see the Americans as a threat yet, because they're desperately trying to keep the Americans engaged in Europe, there is the likelihood that if, say, the Trump administration were to end sooner rather than later, and say Donald Trump, for health reasons, has to, resign and JD Vance then becomes president of the United States, things are going to take a decidedly bad turn for transatlantic relations. How do you see this?
this is a nightmare. This is a nightmare that Europeans don't want to happen. We have seen J.D. Vance, especially in the context of the German legislative elections earlier
Yeah.
this year, when he was campaigning for AfD, for it is a sitting U.S. president who endorsed a post-fascist political force in the biggest EU member state, that is the biggest threat to the EU and to transatlantic relationship. It is not a pro-American force, whatever Mr. Trump or Mr. Vance perceives about them. This was linked with, of course, Elon Musk as well, also endorsing AfD. This is a libertarian perspective of on liberty. In Europe, we also have such libertarian perspective on freedom, on liberty, that is a free riding. Effectively, this is what it is. It's about free riding. It's a life without rules. It's do what you want without consequences. Now, I told you it's a nightmare to have U.S. President J.D. Vance today.
Mhm.
This is a plan B that I also talked about, that Europeans need to be ready to plug it in the moment situation like this occurs. We do not have a war in the West. We do not want to have any war in the West. We have actually to take in Australia as well. The sanctions that Trump has envisaged on us, we negotiated some of that. So we are having so many pro-American statements coming from European leadership these days, that you have left-wing politicians accusing European leadership of being completely in the American camp in
Mm.
order to calm down the waters. It's all in order to calm down the waters, to make sure that the US is at least on a zero when it comes to Europe, that is not fighting European integration, because European integration is fragile. If
Mm.
the American umbrella was not only insecurity for the post 1945, it was
Yep.
actually a very important political umbrella supportive of the European integration. Trump won 2016, 2020 was the or 2017, 2021 was the first American presidency that vocally, verbally pronounced that he's against EU, that he would like EU to be gone, removed, etc. Paradoxically, this is also recognition of the power that Brussels has, the regulatory power rather than the military power. You called it economic might. That is a little bit whining if you look at the Draghi report, economic might. Over last decade, it is more this regulatory power that what we make rules here, they go global, including AI, including green tech, a lot, including migration solutions. I mean, here's a conversation. Not only our solutions are taken, but also Australian cases are looked at, and US and UK. So, but the regulatory affairs is Europe is very strong on. Political angle, we are growing. We've been weak, but this is coming together definitely. We are developing the security angle, and that is also in order to be able to sustain ourselves without the Americans. But that is not taking in the scenario that Americans are fighting against us. And that would be a question for settlement, a kind of settlement that we have seen between Trump and Xi recently in Busan. That you have a kind of settlement of affairs, understanding of affairs. So if JD Vance is in power or anybody like him, but he's not the only one. There you have the
Sure.
Florida governor and other
Mm,
politicians out there who are not
mm,
going away. I'm fully on your page that the
mm,
Trumpism is going
mm,
to stay and develop and move into something else in the future because there's a vast pool of voters who want to have representatives of that type. And I compare it to the nationalists in Europe because it's easier in Europe. We have a nation. Kind of Democrats in the US have not given up on the flag and rallying behind American values, American sentiment. So that is a fight in the US is a bit different than the fight here. A lot of progressives here have given up the fight and the rally behind the flag, but not all, and that fight is still continues in Europe. But the nightmare is to fight the war in the east and support Ukraine with this war, and
yep.
to have a confrontation in the west. And on top, we have the Chinese, that we have uneasy relationship, and this is a challenge, definitely for us, as much as for anybody else in the world. China is a major power out there, but on that, the European Chinese relations is actually the one that is potentially bringing more benefits. Chinese have not been engaged as much as we were afraid in trying to divide Europeans. The Chinese, we don't have a Europe China policy. I mean, let's be
Mm,
frank, we are lacking that because of various pressures and policies and interests of various European nations in China, especially Germany. Uh, but but we keep our conversations on China, and we have our, let's say, mild strategy where we rather follow Americans on that. But the Chinese have not been as engaged to divide and rule Europe. They may have tested the waters. They've been shown that it's not going to work. Europeans also send a lot of signals to the Chinese that they want to engage with the Chinese on policies, on various issues, and that to build and develop that relationship under new regime. So there are certain limitations. For example, Europeans have blocked Chinese purchase of ports. a couple years ago. So investment of Chinese companies into high tech is very limited, and this is politically driven by member states. There is so many elements out there which shows that we are showing Chinese the limitations of what they can do in Europe, and that's another element on EU enlargement, which is happening because part of EU enlargement to the Balkans is exactly fighting the Chinese, not the American, not the Russian, but the Chinese influence in the Balkans. So this is why there is this kind of speed process of getting Albania, Montenegro by the end of the decade, and maybe some other nations from Western Balkans in a few years after 2030 as well. So we are having that kind of dilemma with all the major powers. We do not want to fight two wars. No empire in the world has ever wanted to fight two wars at the same time. So if the war in the West is coming, let's say 2028 is won by a Democrat. Let's presume this person is more pro-European, whoever that person is. So we have a certain moment in time until 2032, maybe 2036, before the next wave of nationalists forces and anti-European forces comes to Washington. If that is the case, that means we have to prepare for it, and hopefully by then, the Russo-Ukrainian war is over, completely removed from the picture. Ukraine is part of Europe. We have dealt with that. Ukrainian enlargement will be massively changing the European landscape of how EU does its policies, but also will be post-war a major pool of potential economic growth, not only for Ukraine, but for other European nations as well, rebuilding that country post-war. So that is a major challenge for Europe. But once we have peace over there, of course. But hopefully by that time that actually happens.
You're listening to The Focus, where we cut through the noise to bring you clear insights on global affairs. If you're enjoying this discussion, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this episode. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Okay, Piotr, look, I'm no fan of Donald Trump at all, but I can understand where he comes from, that sort of uh, lower socioeconomic public grievance against elite politics in Washington, D.C. He was able to channel that public anger in a very real way for many people. But his criticism of the European Union, for instance, is that the Europeans grew fat and rich under US protection and during a period of free trade. And now that the United States is finding it harder and harder for it to afford its own lifestyle, it needs its tariffs as a way of leveling out America and Europe. So Europe doesn't just run away with a program exploiting American military dominance on the continent so it can just keep on making money hand over fist. So there is that sort of argument that I think that you'll find quite rich in the MAGAverse. But then I look at what you were saying earlier about, no empire wants to fight a two-front war. And I sit back and I say to myself, when in history did any empire have a choice about whether they fought a two-front war? I mean, these things happen by circumstance, and the circumstances seem to be developing as we're speaking. Because if your prognostications about a Trump and a future Trump-like figure were to play themselves out, you're looking at a hostile United States. It ain't going to be a friend of Europe in any way, shape, or form, which puts NATO at risk, it puts the European countries at risk individually, and it puts the whole EU project on thin ice, shall we say. So, what can we possibly do? I mean, if Europe is no international or geopolitical international actor, not really, not in the way that the United States is, Russia is, China is.
It's not a state.
It's not a state. So it's not a state, and it doesn't have a central core by which it can move into that space easily. it's what, a marketplace? And if it's a marketplace, how then do you turn the power of the marketplace into something that can push back against the stresses from the Trumpist American experiment as well as the Putinist, you know, rubbish over the other side of the Ukrainian border? I mean, how then do you see Europe play itself out? I mean, you mentioned China. I think and look, I'm no fan of Xi Jinping of the CCP, so let's put that on the record. But again, just looking at it from a realist perspective, and I have been accused of being an offensive realist much of my academic life. But you would say that then someone in Brussels must know that by hedging one's bets against America's potential rivals, such as China, such as Russia, would give Europe a political and strategic heft it currently doesn't have. What do you think is then preventing that from happening? Do you think the Europeans are so enamored by keeping the American alliance functional in whatever capacity, however reduced it will be, that there is no way they'd ever contemplate moving outside of that orbit in order to save themselves?
Thanks for this. Look, it a lot comes down to what we perceive as international relations, and
Yeah.
international relations. The classical way of doing it is relations between states. And
Mm,
relations between states, they are stronger, they're weaker, they're empires or not. Just example of an empire that chose not to fight two wars, Soviet Union. Soviet Union chose not to send military to fight Japan during Second World War as long as they were fighting in Europe. Only after they finished fighting in Europe, they sent their military to Manchuria and fought the Japanese. It was their
mm,
deliberate choice not to fight the Second War, even though they were in war with Japan for much, much longer, but there were no military activities there between one or the other. Um,
right.
when it comes to realist approach, and has always been a problem with realistic approach to the EU. What is it? It escapes because it's not a state. It's never going to be a state. It's not going to be what Altiero Spinelli wanted, a European federation. It's not going
Mhm.
to happen. There is no end goal in this process. I like and I promote, and therefore, the construction that Jacques Delors used, that this is a political project under construction. It's a political project that member states, because they are the political actors, member states are investing in because they are
Mm.
maximizing their potential by being in Europe. And even if they are run by nationalistic forces, Giorgia Meloni knows that she meets Putin because she's in Europe.
Yeah.
If she was not in Europe, if she didn't have the leverage that she has in the European Council, she would not have the same privileges in Mar-a-Lago.
Mm.
So the question will be when other political centers recognize Europe as a political center. And that is more or less done with questions, of course, nationalistic forces in Paris 2027, nationalistic forces in Berlin, uh, and elsewhere. But more or less in Europe, we have a debate about it. We have some kind of perspective on this. It's much more difficult outside because if you have an American political leader who is not educated about how the world looks like, especially in European affairs, it's usually a guy, sees that it's only countries and they are members of United Nations, for example, and they are all small and they should be United States colonies effectively. They tell us what to do. Trump and America in 2021, 2020, 2025, 2029 is effectively treating Europe as America has treated the rest of the world during Cold War. That
Mm.
it is a subordinated continent that should follow the orders of Washington. Now, We are uneasy about this very clearly. But at the end of the day, we are doing what we can to keep that giant not integrating and making even more fuss. That's effectively what's going on right now. This is the strategy. In the meantime, we are using this threat, American threat, to build ourselves up. We are spending more and more on military, our own. We are procuring part of that outside US, South Korea mostly, but we have a debate in Europe how much of the European increased spending on military should be spent exclusively in Europe. So
That,
that
that's
is
that's a very good question because again, when I think of the many discussions that I've had with my European colleagues, it comes up from my perspective in Australia. Well, we don't know much, but we know something. It's like, well, you've got defense industries. Why aren't you supporting your own defense industries? I mean, it heartens me that the Ukrainians now are going to have the rights to build the Gripen fighter, the Swedish Gripen fighter, in Ukraine. I think it's a brilliant idea. But that it took so long to come to what I would imagine military common sense. You have stuff, you don't you would rather buy an American JSF. And look, the JSF is a very complex and a very controversial aircraft for a whole bunch of reasons, namely cost, complexity, all sorts of things that go into that package. But to be sweet with the Americans and with Lockheed Martin in particular, we all wanted to buy what the Americans are offering. But you've got the Rafale in France, you've got the Gripen in Sweden, you've got the Eurofighter. All of these things, if they are not supported by the European defense industries, will go by the wayside. And the only thing you've got left going for you is dependence on the United States and everything that they have, which I don't think is going to be good for Europe, either at a national level or at a broader European level. Because if you want to then pump prime European industry, you must support Europe. Now, I get the South Korean aspect because the South Koreans are extraordinary. I mean, second only to the Japanese in terms of how they can just switch things on and switch things off. They are just amazing. And I think that there is advantage for that as a stopgap. But again, you've got Rheinmetall. Rheinmetall make tanks. You've got the British Challenger. You've got all sorts of European items and artillery pieces and ammunitions and missiles that can be built in country, in Europe, I should say, as well as employing a lot of people as a side benefit of all of this. So yeah, it makes me scratch my head about this. I mean, here in Australia, we're a farm and a mine. We've got no industry except for what we suck in a little tidbit here or there from the United States. So probably our audience would say, "You're a fine one to talk, John. What's Australia doing?" Well, we're not doing a hell of a lot right now, but we have made one really good acquisition. We're going to buy 10 Japanese frigates, which I think is probably the best acquisition that we've done in a long, long time. Nonetheless, we still have a few disasters to wade through, namely the AUKUS submarines, but that's another story for another time. The problem, of course, now is how will Europe coordinate and try and as you say, pass out or pass, not pass like into pass, but to separate out what stays in Europe and what you buy from abroad, and will there obviously be some sort of reduction in dependence on the United States as a product supplier because you realize that Europe has to stand up at some point because there are all these, very real threats to Europe looking into the not too distant future if things don't go well. Yeah.
I fully sign up to what you said, and I would confirm that it is happening. I mean, your
Right.
worries
Good. Good.
are right, but they are
Yeah.
being addressed. The worry that Europeans have are two.
Mm.
One is that they need to coordinate their purchases,
Yeah.
and second, what is that we don't make,
Mm.
and only then go outside of Europe. So when it comes to the European money, and this is the benefit of having European money, because if you have
Mm.
European money, you can put conditions on how you spend the European money. So the
Yep.
European money has this very high, I don't remember right now how much it is, but it's like about half or so, maybe between one third and one half of all your purchases has to be made in Europe, and you
Mhm.
can go outside only to limited number of places to buy. You cannot buy Russian equipment, for example.
Mm.
So you can only buy within a limited number of partners, and who are those partners? And the question is, of course, who can be involved in this? Because the way it's designed, it's not only European, but the British are very eager to jump in. They are outside of the Union, they have their industry, but they would
Mhm.
love their military to be considered a European for the purpose of that project. So you have those deliberations. They again will take time, but those
Mm.
are definitely taking place. Europeans are not putting the European military production capacities out of work. Quite to the contrary, right
Yep.
now you have maximization of what can be made in European military factories, and another link between green transition and military. You have a number of car factories that are being closed down, and some of them are changed because it takes a moment as well to adapt a factory from one production to another into some kind of military operational facility. And that is taking place. We are spending more. I give you the figure, 343 billion. We are spending more on military. Big chunk of that money stays in Europe, is being spent in Europe. But the problem is, where do you spend your military money, and on what are you spending it on? Is it going to be retirement of former soldiers? That is not really investment
Oh.
into your capacity, and that's a German problem, for example.
Yeah,
That
that's also an investment in social stability, mind you. So
Yes.
it's
Yes,
yeah.
I'm not saying it's a negative thing, but
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
saying
yeah,
maybe we should
yeah,
count our military budgets a bit differently, that we are
yeah,
spending,
yeah,
we are counting the investment rather than
yeah.
into equipment, for example, not the social spendings. Social spendings within the military is one thing. Look, I can give you an example from my country. Military, it's booming, right? 5%
Oh,
of Polish
yes.
GDP is
Huge.
on military. You know what the military in Poland is doing with that money, for example? Building roads.
Mm.
I'm not saying
Well,
it's
you
bad because you
yeah.
need to have those roads. But
Yes.
again, part of the capacity
Mm.
is civilian military. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
GPS was built from military into civilian. European question. We have Galileo. Galileo is much better than GPS. I'm sorry, with the geolocalization. I
Yeah.
mean, of course, we have Starlink, so Starlink is even better than Galileo. But we have Galileo, and Galileo is 100% civilian.
Mm.
We don't have, but we will have a debate if parts of Galileo can be securitized, used by
Yep.
a military, because it is so much better than GPS, what the US Navy is using. So why not having this kind of conversations? I remember having a talk with like 20 years ago with a professor. We were sitting in a panel with a professor of European integration, very senior person, and I asked him, if Europe wants to be a geopolitical actor, it needs to have European spies.
Mm. Mhm.
We don't have European secret service. We don't have European spies. But for 15 years now, we started to develop European diplomacy. European, like it's which is a convergence between national diplomatic forces and European diplomatic force. So it's there, it's growing, it's developing, but it was not an easy process to converge the way they operate diplomats, and those are diplomats. So military is similar. Some of it is integrated already within NATO. We have our debates within the military committee in the council, but we need more of that. More is coming. It has to come naturally. But will we have European spies at some point? at least I want the EU member state spies to talk to one another, to have some kind of information sharing. Some of that
Yeah.
happens within NATO, but we need to have those kind of capacities developed within the EU as well. Maybe at the you will have different kind of level of security, of course, in it. But that those things have to happen, and they happen. And the problem with, again, I'm going back to the issue notion of realist thing. EU is a political actor, not only economic might. It has moved from being only an economic might. If somebody perceives EU only as economic might, will simply be limited in their perspective. The world at large has already perceived EU as a regulatory might. Some of them are fighting it. Um, but now it is so much more engaged into building this security might that is done under American umbrella to protect ourselves because Americans are telling us that we are not spending enough. So we are spending more on ourselves, a little bit purchasing from America to send to Ukraine. But effectively, what Europeans are doing, Europeans are spending collectively more than Russians on military. European economy is not put on military path like the Russians have done with their economy. Um, uh, but we are absolutely present, and we are not only matching the Russian. We, at some point, when this machinery gets going, will outpace the Russians, and this is effectively the European way, buying time. So the kind of prognosis that we need to think 2032 in the current term, by 2032, when the next threat potentially is in the United States, and maybe even 2028 is a threat in the United States, bigger.
Yeah.
But effectively, I would presume that if it's JD Vance and with Trump smoothing out what he has done in the first year in office vis-a-vis Europe, that there is probably a difference of perception in campaign mode what J.D. Vance was doing in Germany, because Germany was electing and then they elected. So now they have to live with that government, whoever is in government. And you didn't see that kind of J.D. Vance talk against Europe in the fall in Europe in the recent months. So that was beginning of the current year. So maybe there is also a realistic reflection in J.D. Vance. Mark Rubio needs to be mentioned here because a lot of positive impact on bringing Trump US to Europe has been it's a work of Mark Rubio, and beginning of the year it was not there. We saw dissolution of USAID, State Department reduced capacities, but with time, Marco Rubio's impact on the president has been rather growing than diminishing, and that is also Ursula von der Leyen. She had a problem of getting through to Trump, and she started to have the personal relationship with him only when Pope died, and they met at the funeral, and ever since. They have an open line of communication. Phones are working. But for the first 4 months or so, 3 months, the phone calls were not coming through. We had a fight over with whom Trump can talk, and Vance was on the negative side. But maybe once he lost it, and there is a dialogue across the Atlantic, so calming the waters of the Atlantic is actually happening right now. My projection that until the end of the current term in the US, the biggest challenge is in France, not in the US, for
Yeah.
European
Yeah.
stability and all this. Maybe there's a way forward that American nationalists are not anti-European like Vance from beginning of the year and Trump beginning of the year, but they can live with it because they have learned that the power is in the EU right now, this political project that is not a state, that it's under construction or what have you, but it's real. And Giorgia Meloni, Viktor Orban will tell them it's real. They may like it, they may not like it, but it's there. EU is not only the Commission. EU is also the Council of Ministers, which is national ministers working together, and the Court of Justice. Our Court of Justice is equal to the US Supreme Court in the significance of its rulings on the world affairs, on the situation on the continent of Europe. On the continent of Europe, when it comes to the rights of people, we have two courts. We have European Court of Justice and another European Court of Human Rights, which is not exactly EU, but largely EU and some other countries, UK included, Norway included, and some Turkey also is in the Council of Europe. This is the organization that hosts the European Court on Human Rights. Russia's not in it. But it's important court for European we mentioned culture as well, and the legal culture, which is the cross-border using the courts by people, using the courts by companies. That is actually part of European machinery as well. And if you look at European, because you are worried, I'm worried, a lot of people are worried about European public. How they are going to react. Look, it's not about being overly optimistic, but Europeans are aware that they are Europeans on top of their national identity, including the French, including the Germans, including the Polish. Majority, I take you from my state, my country, Poland. We have political class, which is 50% nationalistic, 50% non-nationalistic, and 80% of the public wants to stay in the EU. They don't see alternative to it. Even majority of nationalists have no problem identifying as Europeans. They may not like certain policies. They may be opposed Green Deal, transition to sustainable or whatever, but they are not going because of that to see I don't like it, therefore I'm out. A kind of British. The problem of the British has always been that because they negotiated their opt-outs, it was always in or out. Thatcher told them it's an economic project, nothing else. So they had nothing to value. That this is good, this is bad, this is good or bad. On the overall, it is better than outside. No, it went down in 2016 as a one question, in and out, in or out, and it was enough for a lot of people to vote out because of whatever they considered, and people voting stay just needed a lot of arguments to convince those people who had a single argument to vote no. So it was a large coalition of people who wanted to leave for various reasons, and we simply cannot have that again. And it was really interesting that in 2016, post June, when the British had their referendum, everywhere in the EU, everywhere in the remaining countries, the sentiment towards Europe grew. And Europeans, and this is my understanding, that Europeans see that there is a possibility to be critical towards people who are in government, collective government, European Council, European Commission, Parliament, and at the same time stay pro-European. And this is why you can vote Giorgia Meloni, you can vote other nationalists into office to be more defensive within what states should do, but not exactly leaving the union. And that gives me a certain comfort because I do follow the nationalistic discourse in country like Poland, where their issue of exit is on the table, but majority of people never supports it. So even the biggest nationalistic political forces, 2 out of 3 are against having a referendum because they would probably lose it. So that is comforting, and I hope, rather than I hope that the French in 2027 will also be in a situation where they can elect a president that is a non-nationalistic, because it seems that there are three camps in France. One very strong left wing, about a third of the populace, a very strong radical nationalistic up to 35, 40%, and the center. And the center gets reduced. But if there will be a way to have a candidate who is a nationalistic candidate and candidate who is a not nationalistic candidate, there still is a majority, potentially, there's still a majority of people who will vote in the non nationalist. My only worry in that scenario is that if you have a far left candidate, it may be so polarizing that you will elect a nationalist leader, even if majority of the public is not nationalistic. That happened in Chile. Out of all places, they've elected a very progressive president, and they drafted a very progressive constitution, which was too progressive. So it was rejected in a referendum. It was too far going left. So that's the worry with France. If the system has a candidate who cannot win majority, that would be truly a worry. Plus, of course, the French left is also Euro skeptic. So there's another threat from that angle, but that is not something that is the biggest threat out there right now.
Piotr, this has been a magnum opus on Europe. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your insights on the focus this evening.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to the comments that will come out.
Oh, I'm sure there'll be a few. Europe's experiment with power is still unfolding. From Brussels to the battlefields of Ukraine, from Paris to Warsaw, the question remains, can 27 nations act as one when the stakes are existential? My thanks to Piotr Maciej Kaczyński for joining us today. Now on to questions for the audience. Do you believe the European Union can ever act as a true military power, or will national interests always get in the way? Has the rise of right-wing and populist parties made Europe stronger through diversity of opinion or weaker through division? If the US steps back from Europe, who should take the lead? France, Germany, Poland, or no one at all? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Auscast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Sear. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on the Focus Pod adl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.